Imagine walking into a room brimming with life. Laughter spills from every corner. Glasses clink. Voices overlap in a tangled web of stories, jokes, and updates. People lean into each other, eager, animated, alive. This, we are told, is connection. This is community. This is what it means to live well. Now, shift the frame. At the edge of that same room, someone stands alone. Not nervous, not awkward, just still. They aren't scanning the crowd for a familiar face. They're not checking their phone. They aren't retreating. They simply aren't interested. There's no tension in their solitude, only presence. While the crowd is pulled outward, they are drawn inward. They are not lonely. They are elsewhere. And the question arises, why? Why do the most thoughtful minds pull away from what society glorifies? Social life. Is it arrogance? Is it trauma? Or could it be something more radical? Could it be that a deep mind simply finds little nourishment in constant noise? To understand that silence, we turn to someone who lived inside it, Arthur Schopenhauer. Arthur Schopenhauer once made a radical observation, that the more intelligent a person is, the less they need from the world. Not because they're arrogant, not because they dislike people, but because their inner life is rich enough. While most people reach outward for stimulation, toward conversations, novelty, and constant engagement, the intelligent are drawn inward, not out of escapism, but because the internal terrain of their mind offers more nuance, more challenge, and often more truth. They don't seek distraction. They seek depth. And that depth rarely lives in the noise of the crowd. In the world as will and representation, Schopenhauer proposed that the average person seeks constant company because they fear the silence of their own mind. Left alone, they confront themselves, their doubts, their contradictions, their unresolved discomfort, and they don't like what they find. But the truly thinking mind, it doesn't run from silence. It thrives in it. It welcomes stillness not as a void, but as a canvas. Its own thoughts become companions. Its imagination becomes conversation. Its curiosity becomes purpose. Solitude, for such a mind, is not a punishment. It is a resource, a wellspring of insight, a crucible for clarity. In solitude, ideas don't compete with distraction. They mature. They take shape. They're examined, reworked, sometimes dismantled. And through that process, the self becomes more coherent. This doesn't mean intelligent people dislike humanity. It means they've chosen to redirect their energy away from social maintenance and toward intellectual cultivation. In a world that glorifies external stimulation, this quiet inwardness appears strange. It's misunderstood as coldness, misread as distance. But it's neither. It's focus. Because emotional depth doesn't require an audience, and fulfillment doesn't demand noise. Perhaps this is why the intelligent often appear detached, not because they lack connection, but because their standards for connection are higher. They don't crave company. They crave resonance. They don't need to be seen by many, just understood by a few. They are interested in being honest with themselves and staying loyal to what matters, even if it means walking alone. They are not running from relationships. They are simply unwilling to trade inner peace for external attention. This, Schopenhauer argued, is not a rejection of others, but a refusal to abandon the self, just to feel socially full. Because what lives inside a thinking mind can be more vivid, more demanding, and more fulfilling than any room full of voices. But if solitude is so fulfilling, why do we all grow up being told? That constant connection is the key to happiness. From the earliest age, we're taught that to be social is to be successful, that to have many friends is to be likable, that to be alone is a problem. School rewards the extrovert. Culture celebrates the influencer. Movies equate popularity with worth. We don't just normalize connection, we glorify it. But here's the deeper question. Do people actually crave social life? Or are they simply terrified of what happens in its absence? We are told that loneliness is dangerous, that isolation is a form of personal failure. But perhaps what we fear is not the absence of others, but the presence of ourselves, unfiltered, uncomforted, and undistracted. Psychologists call it an external locus of validation, a mindset in which your sense of worth depends entirely on external approval. In this model, you exist through the eyes of others. You are only real when reflected in someone else's gaze. It's not about real connection. It's about reassurance, about being seen, liked, recognized, even if it's for a version of you that isn't real. The group tells you you're okay. The crowd gives you identity. You use noise to silence a self you never learned to face. You become someone, so you don't have to meet yourself. This is why so much of social interaction feels scripted. It's not rooted in presence, but in performance. We play roles. We polish sentences. We adjust tone, posture, opinions, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of rejection, fear of awkwardness, fear of being fully seen and found, lacking. And when the mask finally slips, many are left with a terrifying realization they don't actually know who they are without the audience. This is where intelligent individuals begin to diverge, not because they're better, but because they're anchored. They're not necessarily antisocial. They're just internally referenced. They don't seek applause because they no longer need it to feel real. Their identity doesn't swing on the hinge of public opinion. It stands on something deeper. And because of that, they don't chase attention. They conserve their presence like a resource, while others fill the silence. To avoid discomfort, the intelligent turn toward it because they've already made peace with their own company. This isn't arrogance, it's self-possession. And once you realize that your worth isn't something others give you, but something you uncover on your own, you're no longer compelled to perform. You stop needing to be understood, to feel valid. You stop editing your truth to fit in. And perhaps that's why those who think deeply tend to walk quietly. They don't shout to be seen. They withdraw to stay clear. And this is where intelligence breaks the pattern, because it begins to question what others accept. Most social interaction isn't built on truth. It's built on structure, on ritual, expectation, and unspoken rules. We greet each other with smiles that aren't always sincere. We ask, "How are you?" without really wanting the answer. We laugh on cue. We nod on rhythm. We speak not always to express, but often to perform, to maintain cohesion, to keep the air light, to avoid discomfort. In this system, presence is secondary, conformity is primary. And for many, that's enough. They adapt. They learn to code switch, to speak the language of social acceptance. But for the intelligent mind, the mind that is naturally inclined toward truth, coherence, and depth, this performative layer is deeply fatiguing. It senses the split dash, between who people are and who they pretend to be, between what is said and what is meant. And that tension, however subtle, creates dissonance. A dinner party may be full of conversation, but leave the thinker feeling empty. A work event may offer connection on paper, but leave them wondering if anyone was actually present. It's not that they dislike people. They dislike pretense, what others call connection. They see as coordinated masking. They notice how quickly people shift tones to match social roles, how opinions bend subtly to fit the majority, how ideas are filtered, softened, withheld. Not because they're wrong, but because they're inconvenient. And in witnessing that, something changes. The intelligent individual begins to disengage, not out of superiority, but out of clarity. They realize that much of what passes for connection is simply coordination, a synchronized exchange of signals. That prioritizes comfort over honesty. And once you see that, it's hard to unsee it. It feels like betrayal, to keep showing up where you don't belong. That's why, after a gathering, many intelligent people report a kind of cognitive exhaustion. Not because the event was loud, but because it lacked resonance. Not because they were left out, but because they had to contort themselves, to stay in. The dissonance is subtle, but cumulative, and eventually it becomes a signal. This isn't where I think best. This isn't where I feel most alive. This isn't where I'm most myself. And so they begin to withdraw. Not from people, but from performance. They begin to reserve their energy for spaces where honesty isn't punished, where questions aren't deflected, where stillness is welcome and silence isn't awkward, but sacred. This doesn't mean they're broken. It means they've stopped performing, and that choice often makes them look strange in a world addicted to the mask. But if intelligent people are withdrawing, does that mean they're lonely? Or is it something else entirely? There's a common misconception that anyone who chooses to be alone must be missing something. That solitude is simply the absence of connection. That to prefer silence over company is to suffer in silence. But that assumption collapses the moment we understand the distinction that Schopenhauer made clear. Loneliness is not the same as solitude. Loneliness is a lack. It's the ache of emotional disconnection, of reaching out and finding no one. It's passive. It happens to you. You can be surrounded by people and still feel utterly, terrifyingly alone. But solitude is active. It's chosen. It's when the company of your own mind is not only enough, but preferable. Solitude isn't absence. It's anchoring. It's not isolation. It's introspection. For the thinking mind, for the deeply intelligent and self-aware, solitude is not punishment. It's preparation. It's the space where insight emerges, where distractions dissolve, where thought deepens, and creativity breathes. In solitude, the mind is allowed to roam without interruption. Ideas take root. Inner dialogues unfold, and the individual begins to realize, perhaps for the first time, that being alone does not mean being incomplete. Modern society treats aloneness as something to be cured, but to Schopenhauer, solitude was the natural habitat of the philosopher, a necessary condition for intellectual freedom. He wrote, "A man can be himself only so long as he is alone, and if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom." And that's the paradox. We speak of freedom, but fear the one thing that grants it. Because to be alone requires that we face ourselves, without distraction, without flattery, without the mirror of others. and not everyone is ready for that. But for those who are, solitude becomes liberation. It's not escape, it's elevation. And when solitude becomes a choice, not an escape, it turns into something else, a path to clarity. Society doesn't ask you to fit in, it demands it. From childhood, we're trained not just to behave, but to blend, to mirror what's around us, to adapt to what's expected, even when it means compromising what's true. This is the silent contract of social belonging. Sacrifice authenticity in exchange for acceptance. Psychologists call it normative conformity. The impulse to agree publicly, even when we disagree privately, just to avoid rejection. And for the majority, this works. The cost seems small. A little self-censorship here, a diluted opinion there. It keeps the peace. It keeps you part of something. But for the highly intelligent, this trade-off quickly becomes intolerable. They see the friction between who they are and who they're supposed to perform as. They sense the dissonance between what's said and what's actually meant. Because intelligence doesn't tolerate contradiction, it notices it. And when faced with the choice between truth and comfort, between depth and belonging, they choose the truth, even if it isolates them. They don't dislike people. They dislike pretense. They are not antisocial. They are anti-superficial. To them, small talk isn't harmless. It's wasteful. Social pleasantries aren't polite. They're evasive. They crave conversation that cuts through, connection that's not conditioned on saying the right thing or smiling at the right time. But here's where the paradox deepens. The more authentic you are, the less socially acceptable you may appear. Because when you refuse to conform, when you decline to echo the room, when you speak honestly, even when it's uncomfortable, society doesn't applaud. It recoils. You become too intense, too serious, too much. But what you're actually doing is refusing to betray your inner alignment. And in a world where masks are currency, truth becomes rebellion. Schopenhauer understood this deeply. He believed that the wise would always walk alone. Not because they were unlovable, but because they refused to play a part in a script they didn't write. And when you refuse to play a scripted role, society begins to call you distant, difficult, or even broken. Solitude is often misunderstood as the last resort of the lonely. But history tells a different story. One of men and women who turned away from the crowd, not because they couldn't belong, but because they had more important work to do. Sir Isaac Newton spent years in near total isolation. During the plague years, not wasting time, but developing the foundations of classical physics. He didn't fear silence. He used it to hear what the noise of the world drowned out. Nikola Tesla lived without marriage, without children, and often without conversation. But his solitude gave birth to visions that would shape the modern world. Emily Dickinson, one of America's greatest poets, barely left her home in the last decades of her life. She was not socially excluded. She was voluntarily inward, turning down the volume of the world to listen more clearly to the voice within. Franz Kafka, whose writings now shape existential thought, spent most of his life as an outsider to the very society his work critiqued. He was not bitter, he was observant, and solitude gave him the vantage point. These individuals didn't hide from life, they penetrated it more deeply than most social lives will ever allow. And they weren't anomalies. They were signals, indicators of what happens when a mind values clarity over company, focus over familiarity, and self-possession over social acceptance. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, "Solitude is liberation from the noise of others." Not because others are evil, but because their noise makes it harder to hear your own thoughts. He believed that solitude was not a rejection, but a refinement, a sharpening of awareness, a reclaiming of agency. It wasn't about cutting ties, it was about cutting through distraction. Because for the intelligent, social withdrawal is not the absence of something, but the presence of everything else. Vision, creativity, philosophical clarity, and the time to pursue it without interruption. And this selective isolation, this deliberate distance, isn't weakness, it's sovereignty. Those who choose it don't withdraw because they are tired of others. They're not escaping the world, they're deepening into it. But if they didn't seek people, what did they seek instead? Intelligent people don't withdraw from society because they dislike others. They withdraw because they are drawn towards something else, something society often overlooks or simply doesn't understand. The truth is, they're not chasing acceptance. They're chasing understanding. While the average person may derive satisfaction from being liked, included, or praised, the intelligent derive fulfillment from clarity, depth, and intellectual engagement. They don't fear being misunderstood. They fear living unexamined. And so, when faced with environments that reward performance over principle, surface over substance, they begin to retreat. Not because they're antisocial, but because they've realized that proximity doesn't equal connection, that being surrounded can still feel like being unseen. The intelligent prefer a single conversation. That challenges their mind. Over 1,000 that simply pass the time. They're not avoiding interaction, they're curating meaning. What they value is not the applause of the crowd, but the stillness of a mind in flow. Reading, analyzing, questioning, creating. They would rather spend hours following the trail of a complex idea than spend minutes navigating social formalities. They're not driven by what impresses others. They're driven by what reveals truth. And that drive has a cost, because in choosing depth, they often lose access to the things that make others feel safe. Constant chatter, emotional validation, tribal inclusion. They don't abandon society out of arrogance. They simply reach a point where truth feels better than approval. This makes them appear distant, hard to please, hard to reach. But in reality, they're not difficult. They're just discerning. They don't bond through gossip. They bond through insight. They don't chase popularity. They chase pattern recognition. And that kind of pursuit requires space dash. Mental, emotional, even physical. They need space where thought isn't interrupted, truth isn't punished, and feeling isn't staged. In solitude, they meet ideas that stretch them. In silence, they meet parts of themselves that others never get to see. And it's not because they're avoiding the world, it's because they're trying to understand it more clearly. And that requires distance. They don't want to be the center of attention. They want to be at the center of truth. They don't fear missing out. They fear wasting time on what isn't real. And so, they protect their energy, like one protects sacred ground. Not because it's fragile, but because it's fertile. Because to the intelligent, the inner world is not a place to escape to. It's a place they're building. Carefully, deliberately, unapologetically. And they know, a mind that is free, focused, and fiercely honest is a mind that rarely feels at home. in places where performance is rewarded over perception. And yet, there's a paradox. Because the more you see, the harder it becomes to belong. There's something no one warns you about. When you begin to see clearly, when you start to notice the patterns, the masks, the ego games, the unspoken scripts, when you no longer react, but instead observe, when you stop needing validation and start craving truth. Clarity feels like a gift until you realize it comes with a cost, because once you see the machine, it becomes very hard to keep pretending. You're not inside it. You can't laugh at empty jokes. You can't find comfort in predictable chatter. You can't join conversations that orbit nothing. You no longer fit the room, because the room was built on illusions you've stopped believing in. This is the burden of clarity. It liberates your mind, but separates your heart. Not because you don't want connection, but because so few want it without the conditions. The more you understand, the more invisible you become to those who rely on the surface to feel secure. They say you've changed, you've grown distant, you've withdrawn. But what they don't see is that you're still here, just no longer playing the same game. And when you refuse to perform, you disrupt the illusion. When you speak with uncomfortable honesty, you threaten comfort. That's why many choose to remain quiet, not out of fear, but out of clarity. Because they know that once you step outside the rhythm, you can't return to it without breaking something inside you. Schopenhauer understood this tension. He believed that clarity, true clarity, was both a liberation and a sentence, that the wise, once awakened, would find the world increasingly difficult to rejoin. Not because they're broken, but because they're awake, in a world still dreaming. And so, they walk differently. They listen more than they speak. They think twice before entering any room, not because they're timid, but because they understand what it costs to participate in what no longer feels true. This isn't arrogance, it's consequence. When you see clearly, you begin to understand. That belonging has a price. And sometimes, that price is your integrity. So you choose solitude, not out of superiority, but as a quiet refusal to betray what you now know. And this brings us to the deepest insight of Schopenhauer, one that challenges everything modern society tells you. The greatest misunderstanding is thinking that solitude is born from social failure, that those who walk alone do so because no one invited them in. But Schopenhauer knew better. He saw that real solitude is not the absence of connection. It's the presence of something deeper. Not the lack of stimulation, but the abundance of thought. Not emotional emptiness, but intellectual fullness. The intelligent don't turn away from society because they resent it. They turn away because they've outgrown what it offers. When the applause no longer excites you, when recognition feels irrelevant, when silence becomes sacred, you're no longer seeking to belong. You're seeking to become. Because true fulfillment isn't found in being seen. It's found in being whole, when no one is watching. And that kind of peace, the kind that asks for nothing, can't be granted by the crowd. It's quiet, it's internal, and it's earned. So the next time you feel out of place in a crowd, maybe it's not because something's wrong with you. Maybe it's because something is finally right.